Why would the federal government pay farmers not to farm? Now, I know what you may be thinking. Since when did something this ridiculous start? Well, it's actually been going on for nearly a century, beginning with the Agricultural Adjustment Act under FDR in 1933. Under the AAA, the federal government literally paid subsidies to farmers throughout the Midwest and South not to plant crops on their land. But with the Great Depression in full swing and millions of Americans out of a job, why would the government pay farmers not to produce food? Well, the thought behind the Agricultural Adjustment Act ran a little something like this. During the late 20s and early 30s, technological advancements in agriculture meant the price of food had dropped so low that many farmers were no longer profitable. FDR's idea to keep farms from going bankrupt was actually to raise the price of food. And the federal government would accomplish this by paying farmers subsidies to stop growing crops. So, what was the result of this policy? It was an unmitigated disaster. By trying to solve one problem, the federal government simply created two new ones in its place. On one hand, the federal government did manage to force food prices higher, but ironically, the artificially high cost of food ended up hurting the farmers themselves, who soon found it too expensive to feed their livestock. And even worse, with millions of people out of a job, starvation in the United States actually started to set in for certain parts of the country. The problem with FDR's policy was that he was trying to solve an imbalance of supply and demand by artificially keeping supply down. And to give you an idea of just how absurd that idea is, imagine if the federal government did the same thing with another recent technological development, the automobile. Barely 20 years before FDR, the first Model T was created. But with a sticker price that was more than 200% of the annual income of the average American, almost no one except the ultra-rich could afford one. Yet, technological innovations throughout the 1910s and 20s drastically lowered the cost of a Model T and made it affordable for millions of Americans. In just 20 years, the percentage of American families that owned a car had risen from less than 1% to more than 60%. Now imagine applying the same line of thinking to cars that FDR had used for farmers, fearing that the rapid decline in price would mean that Ford Motor Company would no longer be able to do business. Imagine if the federal government had paid Henry Ford to not produce cars. What incentive would Ford have had to innovate, hire more people, and continue building a company which brought cars to all Americans? The bottom line is scientific and economic innovation can be disruptive, but it's also the very thing that leads to greater opportunity and abundance, provided that arrogant politicians don't insert themselves into a process they don't understand in order to help us.